I sent the divorce letter to my cheating wife and her lover's romantic dinner. She smiled as she opened the envelope, not knowing what awaited her. The restaurant was lit by candles, and she, in her carefully chosen dress, exuded confidence, as if nothing was wrong. She looked at him with that sparkle in her eyes, the same sparkle that had once been mine. He, sitting in front of her, laughed complicitly, perhaps imagining that he was the only one who really knew her now. They were oblivious to what was about to happen. The letter, however, was already in his hands. She didn't know it yet, but the ground was about to disappear beneath her feet. I saw everything from a distance. I knew where they would be, the reserved table, the expensive dishes she liked so much, the wine he always ordered to impress her. I even knew the perfume she would wear, the one I bought years ago for our anniversary. Every detail of the scene was burned into my mind, but this time, it wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about us. I no longer cared about what she felt, what he thought. All that mattered was the letter, the paper that would seal the end of a charade I had endured for far too long. The waiter placed the envelope on the table with a slight smile, and she, without hesitation, took it, as if she was waiting for a special gift. I could almost hear his muffled laughter as his fingers skimmed the edge of the paper. She thought it was a surprise from him, a romantic gesture, something that would reinforce the fantasy she created for herself. But as she read, her expression changed, her face began to lose color, her lips parted in a silent sigh. That certainty that she had in her eyes crumbled. I wanted her to feel, even if for a brief moment, the same pain that consumed me for months. That look of disbelief, of despair, was the beginning of everything I planned. He watched her, confused, not understanding the sudden change in mood. "What's wrong?" he asked, trying to hold her hand across the table. She didn't respond. She just stood there, paralyzed, as if the world had stopped around her. She knew she had been found out, that the game was over. The mask he wore, the double life he led, it was all crumbling before his eyes. I remember the first time I was suspicious. It was a message, simple, too innocent to immediately arouse suspicion. But something told me there was more. There were weeks of uncertainty, sleepless nights, searching the corners of our lives in search of clues. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe that the woman with whom I shared so many years of laughter, secrets and plans, was with someone else. It was as if every word of affection, every gesture of affection, was just a well-told lie. Until the evidence became indisputable. Photos, messages, secret meetings. She was leading a parallel life, and I, like a fool, continued to believe that everything was fine. I then decided that I would no longer be the victim. She wouldn't have the pleasure of slowly destroying me. No, I would be the one to end it all, but in my own time. I waited patiently for the perfect moment, the moment when she would be most vulnerable, believing she was in control. Dinner with him would be the final scene of a film she directed, but whose last minutes I would write. Every word in that letter was carefully chosen. There were no insults, no blatant accusations. Just the naked truth, cold as the blade of a knife that cuts silently but deeply. As she read, I felt a strange relief, like I was freeing myself from an emotional prison. It wasn't revenge. It was something purer, a liberation. She finally knew that I knew, that the game was over, and that from that moment on, she could no longer deceive me. There would be no more lies, no more poorly told excuses, no more absences justified by last-minute meetings. The weight of betrayal, which had suffocated me for so long, was now all upon her. He was still trying to understand what was happening. "What is written there? What did he send?" His question cut through the silence like a knife. She couldn't answer. Tears were already beginning to form in her eyes, but the words wouldn't come out. He looked at the torn envelope, at her shaking hands, and realized that something terrible had happened. "What's going on?" he insisted, now with a hint of desperation in his voice. She finally looked up, but she wasn't the same anymore. The confident smile was gone. In place, there was only emptiness, the awareness that everything was lost. The waiter returned to the table, asking if they needed anything else. But there was nothing left to serve. Dinner had been interrupted by something much bigger than either of them expected. They were trapped at that moment, with no way out. I turned and walked away. I didn't need to be there anymore. I knew that chaos had already begun. The pain I had felt for so long now had a new owner. She was there, in that restaurant, at the table that was once ours, but now was the stage of her despair. There was no turning back. The decision was made. And as I walked down the street, I felt a lightness that I hadn't experienced in a long time. But there was something I still didn't know. Something that would change everything. Because, after all, destiny always has one last trick up its sleeve. Welcome to the channel, where we make it clear, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear here are fiction, but with a clear message: betrayal destroys lives, relationships and hearts. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and turns, where the consequences of infidelity are devastating. Now, sit down and prepare yourself, because the story you are about to hear will leave you breathless. Happy listening. John and Rachel were the perfect couple in everyone's eyes. They lived in a cozy, colonial-style house, a robust construction that carried the history of several generations. It was the type of home that conveyed solidity, both in its architecture and in the family life they appeared to have. Rachel was a successful lawyer, respected among her peers, known for her impeccable ethics and her talent for resolving complex conflicts. John, meanwhile, had a stable career as an entrepreneur, running his own consulting firm. Both were ambitious, but they also seemed to find time to cultivate a relationship of affection and respect. Rachel had an easy, infectious smile, something that immediately drew people to her. She was the type of woman who dominated the room without needing words. Her presence was magnetic, and although her profession required a firm, controlled posture, at home she managed to balance that rigidity with a sweetness that made John feel special. It was as if he was the only one to see this softer side of her. They were the couple everyone admired, the kind of relationship that many believe is beyond reach, almost idealized. For John, marriage was his safe haven. After years dedicated to work and building a solid career, he valued the feeling of coming home to someone who understood the weight of his responsibilities. Rachel was that person. They shared long-term plans, travel dreams, life projects that involved growing together, expanding their horizons and, who knows, building something even bigger. Conversations about the future always seemed filled with optimism. When they talked about what retirement would be like, the two laughed, dreaming of a house by the sea where they could finally put the demands of life aside. On weekends, the couple liked to have friends over for dinner. Laughter echoed throughout the dining room as they shared stories, toasted fine wines and enjoyed the company of other couples who also admired them. It was in these moments that John felt complete, as if the world was a place exactly where he was supposed to be. Rachel, always the perfect hostess, knew how to make each person feel special, and John, in his most reserved way, was proud to have such a charming woman by his side. He saw in Rachel everything he ever wanted: beauty, intelligence and, above all, a solid partnership. However, in recent weeks, something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those observing from the outside, but John felt it. It wasn't something Rachel did, but what she didn't do. The small gestures, the ones he always appreciated, like the gentle touch of his hand during dinner, or the way she laughed at his silly comments at the end of the day, were now absent. Rachel was more distant, more reserved. He tried not to think about it too much, chalking it up to his workload and routine stress. After all, adulthood had its ups and downs, and he believed that, like any couple, they were going through a more difficult phase. John started paying more attention. He noticed that Rachel was spending more time outside, claiming that office commitments had become more intense. Her phone, which used to always be visible, was now kept away for longer, locked by passwords that didn't exist before. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that this was just paranoia on his part, that he was imagining things. Rachel had always been discreet with her work matters, and he had never felt the need to question her. But that intuition, that silent discomfort, continued. The nights when she arrived late, with a plausible excuse on the tip of her tongue, didn't reassure him like they used to. Instead, they left him feeling empty. It wasn't something concrete, but a distrust that seemed to slowly settle inside him, growing every day. He couldn't help but compare it to the beginning of their relationship, when things were different. There was an intensity in the looks, a more frequent touch and the need to be together all the time. Now, it seemed like they were living parallel lives. John wondered if this was something that came with time, something natural in long marriages, or if there was more behind this distance. The doubt began to eat away at him slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but as the days went by, it seemed to increase. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed to be immersed in her own world. When John asked how her day had been, she responded vaguely, without going into much detail, something that was unusual for her. Before, they talked openly about everything, laughed together about small daily tragedies and supported each other in difficult decisions. Now there was an invisible wall between them, a barrier that John couldn't break. He began to wonder if he should confront her. Maybe it was just a phase, maybe they were just disconnected because of the hectic pace of their lives. But still, there was something about the way Rachel avoided certain topics that bothered him. She was always busy, always with some urgent commitment, always distant, as if there was something else demanding her attention. But John, for now, decided not to act. He loved her, and maybe he was just being overly dramatic. They had a life built together, years of trust and complicity. It couldn't be something that serious. He preferred to believe it was just a phase, something temporary, a passing storm on the horizon of a marriage that had always been stable. The sound of Rachel's laughter upstairs brought him back to the present. She was talking on the phone to someone, probably a colleague from work. He heard her mentioning something about a dinner, perhaps an important meeting for a new case she was taking on. He didn't want to interrupt, but that feeling of discomfort was still there, something he could no longer completely ignore. Maybe, sooner or later, he would have to deal with this. For now, he chose to believe that everything was still under control. The following days dragged on for John like a heavy, mechanical routine. The discomfort that previously hid in the shadows of his suspicions now took shape, growing with each moment of silence between him and Rachel. Her smile no longer comforted him, there was something empty and distant in that look that once made him feel complete. Still, he held on to the possibility that maybe he was exaggerating, that maybe this was just a complicated phase in life that would soon pass. But life went on without their closeness returning to normal. John was watching Rachel more closely than ever, trying to find any sign that his suspicions were just a misunderstanding. He wanted to believe it, but her every action seemed to contribute to his growing uneasiness. Her phone, which used to ring freely around the house, was now always in her pocket or purse. The messages that were previously answered in front of him were now accompanied by a hasty apology and a quick departure to another room. One night, as Rachel was preparing for another business dinner, John decided he could no longer ignore his instincts. He watched as she got ready. The dress she chose was the same one she had worn on their wedding anniversary, but this time, it wasn't for him. She put it on with meticulous calm, her hair down in perfect waves, the delicate perfume that John adored. He didn't say anything, but the weight of that scene was enough to confirm what he already feared. Rachel smiled at him as she walked down the stairs. "Don't wait up for me, I might be late," she said, with a casual air that almost made John laugh at his own earlier naivety. He responded with a nod, watching her walk out the door as if it was the last time he would see her like that. When the door closed, he felt a lump form in his throat. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't something I wanted, but there was no choice anymore. He followed Rachel from afar, feeling the weight of each kilometer he walked towards the city center. She drove calmly, without the slightest suspicion that she was being followed. To John, it already felt like theater, a carefully rehearsed performance, where he was the powerless spectator. When Rachel's car stopped in front of a fancy restaurant, he parked at a distance, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He watched as she got out of the car, adjusting her dress with an automatic gesture, and entered the restaurant. John hesitated for a moment, the thought of confronting her right there crossing his mind like a sudden storm. But no, it wasn't time yet. He would wait. I needed to see it. I needed to be sure. Outside, the night seemed to drag on as he watched through the restaurant's windows. And then, there he was. The man with whom she shared the smiles that were once hers. John recognized him immediately from the photos on Rachel's cell phone. The way she leaned toward him, the way their hands casually touched on the table, all of it was now bitter confirmation of what he already knew but refused to accept. Inside, John felt a mixture of emotions that slowly consumed him. The love he still felt for Rachel turned into something darker, into a pain he couldn't describe. Betrayed, humiliated, he watched in silence the scene he never imagined experiencing. They laughed, carefree, as if the world around them didn't exist. And in some ways, for Rachel, it really didn't exist. She had created a new reality, a life that didn't include John. Anger was building inside him, but at the same time there was a strange feeling of calm. He was there, witnessing everything. There were no more doubts, no more room for assumptions. The betrayal was before him, clear as the reflection of the restaurant lights in the windows. He felt the moment everything inside him changed, when the man who got into that car to follow Rachel disappeared, giving way to someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Dinner continued and, with every smile, with every subtle touch, John felt further away from the woman he once knew. What was once a shared life now seemed like a cruel farce, and he was just a spectator. The divorce letter was ready, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. She didn't know it yet, but the outcome was closer than she ever imagined. The waiter appeared with a bottle of wine, something John had ordered over the phone, anticipating that moment. Rachel, not knowing what would come next, smiled at the waiter, believing it was just another surprise from the man sitting in front of her. She opened the envelope with a confident smile, but as soon as her eyes skimmed over the first few words, the expression on her face turned to one of confusion and dread. John watched from afar, his heart racing, as Rachel read and reread the document. The color drained from his face, his hands shook slightly. She tried to hide her reaction, but the man in front of her noticed. "What happened?" he asked, not understanding the sudden change. But Rachel couldn't respond. His lips moved, but no words came out. In the end, there was no denying it. The betrayal was open, but now so was the truth that John had kept. He turned around and left, leaving the chaos he created behind. The restaurant's atmosphere seemed frozen in time, even though the world continued to spin around it. For Rachel, everything around her had disappeared. The candlelight, the sound of distant conversations, and the shine of the cutlery reflected in the glasses went out at the exact moment his eyes read the words coldly printed on the divorce letter. The document had fallen from his shaking hands, as his mind desperately tried to understand how things had gotten to this point. She couldn't form a coherent thought. All that was left was emptiness, the distant sound of his own ragged breathing, and Mark's gaze fixed in front of him, confused and anxious. "Rachel, what's wrong? What's going on?" His voice cut through the silence, bringing her back to reality. She looked at him, her lips moving soundlessly, as if searching for words that just weren't coming. The letter was still there, open on the table, each word screaming what she feared. John knew. He always knew. Mark, still not understanding the gravity of the situation, leaned over to pick up the letter. His eyes scanned the document for a few seconds before also falling still. "It's a divorce letter," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He then looked at Rachel in disbelief. "He knows." Rachel closed her eyes, as if she could erase everything with a single blink. But Mark's words rang in his head. Yes, he knew. John had discovered the betrayal, but had said nothing. There were no confrontations, no accusations. Just silence. And now, everything was exposed. The weight of this revelation came crashing down on her with a force that made her almost lose her breath. Mark, still trying to comprehend the extent of the situation, ran his hands through his hair in frustration. This changes everything, he said, his voice shaking slightly. You told me you were unhappy, that he didn't care anymore. But he knew all along, Rachel. Now, what are we going to do? Rachel finally found her voice, but it came out weak, barely a whisper. I don't know. The discomfort grew. They were no longer in control of the situation. The power, which previously seemed to be in Rachel's hands, now belonged completely to John. And this realization only made the despair increase. The silence between them was interrupted when the waiter, unaware of the emotional turmoil, approached with a polite smile. Is everything okay here, gentlemen? Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Mark nodded, signaling that everything was under control, but clearly, it wasn't. The waiter walked away, and again the silence settled in, heavy and oppressive. Rachel needed to think. I needed to understand how everything had unfolded so quickly and brutally. But when she looked at Mark, she saw something different. There was a tension in the air, a distance that hadn't existed before. As if, suddenly, he was there, but already far away at the same time. He seemed nervous, restless. And then, the truth, which she had ignored until that moment, slowly began to emerge. Mark. She began, hesitantly. What are you thinking? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked away, rubbing his hands together nervously. Rachel, we need to talk. Her heart sped up. There was something in his eyes, something she had never seen before. A shadow of doubt, perhaps even regret. Talk about what? She asked, her voice wavering. Mark took a deep breath, as if he was preparing himself for something he knew would be difficult to say. I don't know if we both. I don't know if it's a good idea to go through with this. Rachel felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. What are you saying? She asked, her voice louder now, a hint of desperation creeping into her words. Mark looked at her directly, his face now serious, almost cold. I'm married too, Rachel. Those words hit Rachel like an unexpected blow. She blinked several times, trying to absorb what she had just heard. Married? She repeated in disbelief. You never told me you were married. He nodded, pressing his lips into a thin line. I know. I hid it from you. At first, I thought it would never matter. But now, seeing how John handled the situation, I realize I can't go on with this. I have a wife. I have a family. Rachel leaned forward, as if the weight of the revelation had pushed her against the table. You have a wife, she repeated, feeling anger bubbling beneath her skin. And you let me believe that I was the only person in your life, that the two of us could build something together. How could you do that? Mark didn't back down. His eyes were fixed on her, but there was a cold determination in his voice. I lied, yes. But you also lied to John. We both built this on lies. And now I see how much it can destroy. Not only our lives, but the lives of other people who don't deserve to suffer for our choices. Indignation and despair mixed in Rachel. And now you want to just go back to your life? Like nothing happened. Mark was silent for a moment, his lips tight, his eyes tired. I don't know what else to do, Rachel. This has gone too far. And seeing what happened today, I realize we can't continue. Rachel felt a mixture of humiliation and anger wash over her. It wasn't just the betrayal that consumed her now, but the realization that she had been used. She sacrificed her marriage, her life with John, for someone who never intended to be completely with her. Mark had a wife, a home, something he never mentioned, and now, at the moment when everything was starting to fall apart, he wanted to leave without looking back. "You can't just leave me like this," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You can't do this to me now." Mark shook his head, his expression firm. "I can't keep living a lie, Rachel. I can't destroy any more lives." Silence settled between them again, heavy, unbearable. Rachel looked at the divorce letter on the table and then at the man in front of her, the man who, until minutes ago, she believed was her new chance at happiness. Now it all seemed like a cruel illusion. She stood up from the table, her legs shaking slightly. "I need some time to think," she said, her voice cold, distant. Mark didn't say anything. He just watched her as she picked up her things and left the restaurant, without looking back. Rachel left the restaurant with quick steps, almost running over people walking along the sidewalks. The cold night air hit her face, but the icy breeze wasn't enough to cool the chaos boiling inside her. Every step he took seemed to echo the emptiness that now filled his heart. Mark's words still resonated in his mind, heavy as stones. "I'm also married." She repeated these words silently, trying to find some meaning, some justification for what had just happened. Her world, which until that moment had seemed under control, had collapsed in a matter of minutes. Streetlights reflected off the windows of closed stores, but Rachel saw nothing but her own confusion. How had she allowed everything to get to this point? How could she be so blind, so naive, to the point of believing that Mark was the solution to her problems? Now, in addition to the pain of losing John, she carried the shame of having been used, manipulated by someone who treated her as a sideline to his family life. The feeling of betrayal deepened, but this time, it wasn't just directed at John. Mark had also betrayed her trust, and now she found herself alone, trapped in a web of lies that she herself had helped weave. The moral dilemma was overwhelming. On the one hand, she knew that she had broken her marriage vows, betrayed the man who, despite everything, still seemed to love her. On the other, she had been betrayed by someone in whom she placed her hope for a new life, a different future. When she stopped walking, she realized she was in front of the building where she and John lived. He looked up at the apartment window, the lights off, indicating that John was probably not home. For a brief moment, he felt the temptation to go back, to go in and try to explain, to get on his knees and ask for forgiveness, to beg for a second chance. But at the same time, I knew it might be too late for that. The damage was already done. The cold words of the divorce letter still lingered in her mind, a bitter reminder that John's decision had already been made. Rachel approached the building's door, hesitantly, her heart heavy. She knew she needed to face what she had done, but the fear of being rejected, of not being forgiven, paralyzed her. The hand hovered over the doorknob for a few seconds, until he decided to enter. The lobby was empty, absolute silence enveloped her, amplifying the sound of her own footsteps. The elevator rose slowly, each floor that passed seemed to increase his anxiety. What would she say to John? What was left to be said? When the elevator door opened, she walked down the hall, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the apartment door, he hesitated again. What if John didn't want her there anymore? What if he had already taken all the steps to remove her from his life? The thought was overwhelming, but she needed to face the consequences of her choices. When she opened the apartment door, silence greeted her like a cold wave. The lights were off, and there was no sign of John. The room was tidy, impeccable, as if he hadn't returned home after the silent confrontation he had created in the restaurant. Rachel stood still for a few minutes, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings that now seemed strange, distant. It was the house they had built together, but suddenly it no longer seemed to belong to her. She walked over to the couch and sat down, the weight of her emotions finally catching up with her completely. The tears he had been holding back all night began to flow, silently, as his body shook under the pressure of everything that had happened. Regret dominated her, but alongside it, there was a deep sense of helplessness. There was no turning back. The choices she had made over the past few months had led her here, and now she needed to deal with the consequences. The apartment door opened with a soft click, and Rachel knew, without needing to look, that it was John. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood up, turning to face him. His gaze was calm, but there was a coldness there that she had never seen before. He walked slowly into the room, without saying a word, his eyes fixed on her. "John," Rachel began, but her voice trailed off. She didn't know what to say, didn't know where to start. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and controlled. "You read the letter?" Rachel nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Lee." You don't need to say anything," John interrupted, with a calmness that left her even more disconcerted. "I already know everything." His words hit her hard. There was no more room for excuses, for justifications. He knew. "I always knew." John walked over to the coffee table and placed the keys on it, the sound echoing through the silent room. "Why, Rachel? I need to understand. Why did you do this?" She hesitated, the words stuck in her throat. How could I explain the inexplicable? How could he justify betraying the man who was always by his side, who gave him everything? "I don't know," she finally replied, her voice weak and broken. "I was unhappy. I thought maybe." "Unhappy?" His voice was incredulous. "And the solution was to look for someone else? Didn't you think we could work this out together?" Rachel looked down, unable to meet John's gaze. "I was confused, things between us weren't the same as before." John sighed, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Things change, Rachel. This is part of a marriage. But this what you did," he didn't finish the sentence, letting the silence linger between them. Rachel felt her body shake under the weight of John's judgment. She knew she was wrong, but she didn't know how to fix what she had broken. Finally, John turned, walking towards the door. He stopped for a moment, without looking back. "I'm going out for a few days. I need time to think." Rachel took a step forward, desperation taking over her. "John, please." Not now," he said firmly. "Maybe I can forgive you someday, but right now. I just need to stay away." And with that, he left, leaving Rachel alone, shrouded in silence and guilt. The emptiness she felt when he closed the door behind him was overwhelming. She knew this was the beginning of something she couldn't control, something that might never be repaired. The silence in Rachel and John's apartment was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Rachel spent the next few days immersed in an emotional torpor, unable to think about anything other than John's words. He had left without giving a return date, without offering the slightest hope of reconciliation. The space around her, which once felt like a safe home, was now a suffocating prison, filled with memories of a love she had destroyed. She tried to fill her days with everyday tasks, but nothing took her out of that state of constant anxiety. His mind, always caught up in what would happen next, wavered between guilt and despair. Rachel knew her betrayal had been the breaking point, but the void left by John was unbearable. He had been more than her husband, he was her confidant, her safe haven. And now, she was alone, facing the consequences of her actions. One afternoon, after days of silence, Rachel received a message. Mark's name appeared on the screen, and her heart sank. She hesitated for a moment, fighting the urge to ignore him, but she knew she needed answers. When he opened the message, what he read made his stomach turn. Mark said his wife had discovered everything. His marriage, which she thought was distant and unimportant, was about to fall apart as well. He blamed her. "I believe that, in some way, everything that had happened was a consequence of Rachel's choices." His words were cold and calculated, the tone had a bitterness she hadn't expected. He had been the man she sought comfort from, but now, faced with the collapse of his own life, Mark threw her under the bus, trying to alleviate his own guilt. Rachel closed the phone, the weight of what she had done crushing her in a way she hadn't yet felt. There was no escape. Not only did she destroy her own marriage, but she was also involved in the ruin of another family. The feeling of isolation became unbearable. All that was left was to face the truth: she had betrayed everyone around her, but most of all, she had betrayed herself. John, in turn, had found refuge in the home of an old friend. The nights were long, full of contradictory thoughts. He wavered between anger and sadness, remembering the life he had with Rachel and the betrayal she had imposed on him. The vision of Rachel with another man, the lie she had lived for months, consumed him. He walked around the city, trying to find answers, but the only thing he found was more questions. A part of him wanted to forgive her. There was something inside him that still loved her, something that wanted to find a way back. But another part, the stronger one, knew he could never look at her the same way. The betrayal had changed everything. John knew that even if he forgave them, they would never be the same couple again. However, in a moment of clarity, he decided he needed to find his own closure. I couldn't move on with my life without one last conversation. He needed to tell Rachel how he felt, needed to hear her apology, even if it didn't mean reconciliation. When he finally returned to the apartment, Rachel was sitting on the couch, her face pale and tired. Her eyes met John's, and for a moment, the silence that formed between them seemed so thick it was almost palpable. "John," Rachel began, her voice weak and hesitant. "You don't need to say anything," he interrupted, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I came here to tell you that I loved you, Rachel. I really did. And maybe part of me still does. But what you did, I can't go through with this anymore." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to beg for a chance, but she knew it was too late. The damage had been done. John continued, his voice firm but with an underlying pain. "I'm not here to fight or make accusations. I just needed to say this. I needed to see you one last time and end this the right way. Please, John." She tried, but her voice trailed off. "I forgive you," he said, surprising her. "But it's not the kind of forgiveness that will bring us back. It's the kind of forgiveness that allows me to move on. That allows me to free myself from all of this." Rachel broke down in tears, but John remained firm. He had already made his choice. Without looking back, he grabbed his things and left the apartment for the last time. It was the end. And for both, the certainty that they would never be the same again. Mark, on the other hand, saw his life fall apart in a more brutal way. His wife, upon discovering the betrayal, not only kicked him out of the house, but also filed an aggressive divorce process, demanding all of his assets and custody of his children. He was left with nothing, thrown into a small, cold apartment, a shadow of the confident man who once used Rachel as his hobby. Meanwhile, Rachel was forced to confront her loneliness. Without John, without Mark, and with her reputation compromised, she had to face the void she had created. The nights were long, the apartment that once felt like home was now nothing more than an echo of everything she lost. There was no turning back for any of the three. And so our story ends. What did you think? Leave your opinion in the comments, we want to know what you think about this ending. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this, where we explore the consequences of the choices we make in life. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Cheating destroys lives, relationships and families. Until next time.